G'day expats and welcome to another episode of Expat Chat, episode 141. And today, and as always, I'm joined with my co-host, Brett Evans, who is the founder and managing director for the Europe, Middle East and Africa region. One of my best mates, business mentors, the list can go on. Maybe future goddad as well to a
Oh,
child that's coming.
yeah,
Ooh.
yeah, exactly. James is about to realize how time poor he's going to be.
Oh, shit. uh, But welcome, Brett. Good episode coming up with today's topic. How's things on your side? How's the sand pit? What's the weather like? Heating up?
Mate, we've had an early start, which we're not happy about.
Yep.
The other
No.
day I was driving
Oh,
along on Sunday, it was 48 degrees. So, but it's cooled down now. We've had a nice change. We've got nor'westers or nor'easters, sorry, coming through down from the
mm,
Gulf.
mm.
Very interesting place to be right now. There's a lot going on in terms of the region. So much so that even Trump said he's now going to change the name of the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Gulf. Now,
Oh
interesting
God.
fact find for those who do not live in the Middle East, it's a real contentious topic.
Yes.
Everyone in Saudi Arabia, UAE calls it the Arabian Gulf. Obviously, the
Yep.
Iranians call it the Persian Gulf. Internationally, it's been referred to as the Persian Gulf, but now
Yep.
it's flipping back the other way. But mate, let's not segue for the folks out there on the call. Big round of applause for Mr. James Ridley, Managing Director for the APAC region, who's joining me as always today and every day. Mate, what it's been a lot going on the last week, and we're going to talk
Oh
about
yeah.
today Labor 2.0. What does it mean for expats? Because not only did they win, but they increased their margin, which just blew everyone away. And
Yes.
according to Labor, even their internal polling didn't show this. So, yeah,
That's
damn.
right. It's been the last couple of weeks have been very interesting. I mean, we all went to the voting polls. Peter Dutton couldn't even keep his own seat, which I think that's
Yeah.
the first time that's happened in history for a coalition leader. Maybe might have happened to Howard actually, but
Or
they did
Houston.
reference as
I
a
think Houston. I
yeah
think Houston. Yeah.
yeah yeah that's right yeah. So that's pretty rare that you don't even hold your own seat. So he's obviously resigned now and he's out of office and he's not going back to the government. He said 24 years of service apparently. But ALP, yes, they have the majority and they've also got the backing on the Greens side as well. And that is a bit concerning for, I would say, a lot of the tax policies that we've previously heard from ALP, I would say over the last 5, 6 years. Um, and there's a
Everything
lot
is
of
back on
water
the
that
table.
that's it. There's a lot of water that needs to go on a bridge, but I mean, things that come to mind, which were previously announced, we know, the superannuation $3 million tax item, briefly talk about that one. Uh, Modernizing tax residency rules for expats, that's a big one. That's probably, yeah, that's that. We're, again, the big question mark hanging over that one. And then a lot of their main focus for both parties was around housing affordability, how to help people get into, obviously, the property market. And then the first order of business for Albanese is wiping 20% of HEX debt immediately. So it's interesting to see what the priority is. Now, Senate doesn't sit until August. Um, but some of the things they want to do are retrospective and it could be quite punitive. And what I'm drilling down on here is this $3 million super tax. And the way the government is shaped right now, a lot of policies that Labor would want to get through, there is a much higher probability that they could
Yep.
get them through now. There's less resistance because the independents, David Pocock, former rugby union player, an absolute weapon, the being one of the independents there, but independents have less sway now, less power, the way that the seats look.
They can't gang
So
up.
they can't gang up, they can't slow down some of the policies that we would now expect from ALP to roll through. So it's going to come down to obviously very large lobbyist groups and probably swaying members of the ALP to not vote towards it. So it's yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, why don't we talk about the superannuation tax first? And this is something that was announced, I
Two
say
years ago.
last year. Yeah, it's probably 2 years when the Board of Taxation would have calculated it, but it lost a lot of its momentum last year, and then only probably in the last week or so, it is, I suppose, hovering and littering
Back on
all
the
the news
table.
publications back in Australia. And the reason it's obviously taking so much or causing so much noise in Australia right now is the policy and the legislation that came through was meant to be legislated, enacted as of 1st of July 2025. Now, because Parliament doesn't actually sit until August, there's a high likelihood that in its current form, this $3 million tax could actually be legislated and put through. Now, we might zoom out and just probably roll through what the $3 million tax was.
And mate, before
Yeah.
we go any further, let's complete the compliance officers happy in the world. All the information we're going to share with you good folks today should be treated as informational and educational purposes only. Please do not consider this as personal advice. If you do need to get personal advice, please speak to a specialist like Atlas.
Oh, mate, you nearly let me run away with all this free advice to all our listeners without the compliance
Free
disclaimer.
personal
Holy
advice.
hell. Quick. No, but today just factual information. But the $3 million super tax, very punitive. And essentially what they are legislating or looking to do is have superannuation members with balances over 3 million essentially pay tax on unrealized gains after the financial year has gone. So if we look at probably how this would actually work, it will be very common with superannuation balances where they have property in it. So self-managed super funds where they own residential property or commercial property, they are paying tax on something which isn't a liquid asset, and they're paying tax on the unrealized growth of that asset each year. So it does mean that a lot of Australians are going to make sure that they have a lot of cash in their super so they can pay these taxes on these unrealized gains. And we often refer to it as a mark-to-market election, where you're paying tax as you go. And eventually when you sell down that asset, you would have paid some tax on the unrealized growth already. So you're not paying double tax. But what it doesn't allow for is superannuation balances which aren't invested in property, but let's say they're invested in a diversified share portfolio of a lot of different assets. Those portfolios go up and down every single day. So if we look at having a really strong financial year, 7 to 12%, and then the next year that superannuation balance goes down by, say, 8%, you don't get any tax credits for when it's gone down by 8%. So you pay tax on the growth component, and then it goes down, but you're not getting any benefit there or a claim of a tax refund now that it's gone down. And if you sold out of those assets, again, you still had to pay tax on something which you haven't actually realized the benefit of. So it's a bit ridiculous in its current form. Not only that, the government hasn't thought too much about a lot of superannuation funds in Australia having to build out these new calculators as part of industry funding and be able to automatically calculate these balances at the end of the financial year and then essentially take a lump sum from those member balances for the tax payment which is owed. The other side of it, so that's one side, you're paying tax on something where you're not realizing the benefit of when your balance is over 3 million. But taking this another step, you're also paying a punitive tax. So it's not 15%, which is the ordinary, normal, I suppose, short-term realized gains or short-term income of 15% tax. You're actually paying 30%. You're paying an extra 15% tax on those unrealized gains when your balance is over 3 million. I believe the Greens wanted to reduce the balance to 2 million, which is in line with essentially the transfer balance cap. So don't agree with that one. But it's very punitive because again, you're paying an additional tax on something which you haven't realized the benefit on and you haven't sold down. And in its current form, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. And I really do believe if they do legislate something like this, which is so punitive, a lot of tax advisors, a lot of wealth managers, financial planners like ourselves will have to get a lot more creative and strategic of where we're putting our wealth. Superannuation will be still a powerful tool, but only up until a certain balance. And then it's a case where we look elsewhere. We look at the family trust structure. We look at a company structure when it makes sense. But not only that, I feel as though this is something that they'll legislate. And after 1 or 2 years, they'll realize what an absolute
Whoops.
disaster it is. And they'll go, hang on, this doesn't make any sense. We're going to have to repeal this. And the reason I say that is because anyone that owns property within a self-managed super fund, that would mean that every financial year they have to go out and get a market valuation on their properties every
Yep.
single year, without question. And if they're not getting a valuation, then the ATO or the accountant as well as the auditor won't be able to do their tax return, but they
The
are
mark
due
market.
within a certain time frame. That's right. So they're going to cause a massive issue within the industry, within SMSFs owning commercial property, residential property. But when you look at the traditional super fund industry, having a super fund on Australian Super, CBUS, Host Plus, I can actually see the flow-on effect of members' fees increasing because of all these additional tax calculations and new software that will have to be rolled out to manage these kind of punitive tax that they're going to legislate. So it's a bit of a disaster, and that's why you'll see a lot of lobbyist groups starting to get a lot more noisier, given that they're going back and sitting in August. But I guess when we look at the current legislation, it's very punitive because it's also, I would say, well, there's a bit of a look back here where it's meant to be legislated as of 1st of July 2025, but it might not get actually legislated till later in the year, maybe towards the end of the calendar year, December. So you haven't had any time to prepare. People that are heavy in property will be hitting the panic button a little bit within their supers and going, how do
Big
we
time.
manage this? We've got to make sure we have a significant amount of cash pile so we can pay this tax on something we don't realize the benefit of. It's a bit ridiculous. That's me harping on. Sorry, gents.
No. It's mate, you're spot on. And I think as a couple of points of clarity for the audience, this is an extra tax on the amount over the 3 million. So
That's right.
point number one, let's say you had a $4 million balance. It's the growth that the million over the 3 million experiences, not the amount under 3 million. That's still tax-free and allocated pension phase and taxable at 15% or 10% on realised gains, under 3 mil. I think the other point of clarity too is not indexed. So this is per person, not per couple, for example. So
Yep.
technically you could have 2.9 million or up to 3 million per husband and wife. And look, most people go, oh yeah, I've got 2 mil each
Yeah.
or 1 mil each where we're safe as houses and not going to worry about it. Because it is not indexed, it's not so much our generation, but your kids and my kids' generation is going to feel the brunt of this. Because when you index this out, 3 million in 20, 30, 40 years time is going to be like 500,000 now on an
Yep.
index inflation adjusted. So it does come
That's
down a
right.
lot. And, if our friends, in inverted commas, the Greens, get their way of 2 million, I think that time frame comes forward, to like 10, 20 years. So it comes
Yeah.
forward very, very quickly. So I think that's, 2 points that are important to take out of this. I think the hardest bit is going to be for those with large single assets inside their super, demarcating. I mean, if you had a building that's worth 5 million inside your super, when you look at, say, a business owner who bought their building premises for their operations, which they can do. Arm's length transactions are not an issue for them. If you look at the situation where the building's worth 5 mil, how do you cut the building into 40% and 60%, and which one's gone up in value, and is it the crappier part of the building or is it the gooder part of it? To me,
Oh,
the only other time I've ever
yeah.
seen this type of mark to market and paying tax on unrealized gains has been in Denmark. So shout out to the folks in Copenhagen, Aussies up there. If you live there and you own ETFs that are not domiciled inside Denmark, then they pay unrealized capital gains tax on the growth. So they hold an ASX 200 ETF, they'll pay that. And as you say, they don't get the benefit on the downside. So
Mm.
what this is going to mean is, in my mind, when I first heard this, I thought, okay, there's ways to manage this. And one of the most important ways is going to be trying to cap your gains in that financial year. You're not going to be able to do this in an industry super fund. You're not going to be able to do this in, so it's going to be either a wrap retail account or an SMSF where you get to be able to try and control it. And you touched on a good point before about looking at alternative structures and vehicles that you can, sort of save and fund retirement in the future in a very tax optimized way. And that jumps on to our next topic that Labor has been talking about, and that's trusts. Will they touch trusts? Because that's been this recurring theme in the background with Labor for the last, better part.
As,
And now that
as
they've increased their majority, they're going to say, we've got a mandate. The Australian population has overwhelmingly encouraged us to go all in. And do they talk about trust? do they talk about negative gearing? I mean, that's been one that's been a bit of a poison chalice for Labor for the last couple of years. But do they have a crack at that? Like there's all these permutations now that I'm sure Albo on Saturday night went to bed just going, I can do this, I can do this, like a kid in a candy store because he's got the majority now. He's increased his majority. So that's the big one for us. I mean, there'll be, by the time this post goes out, there'll be a blog article on our website, atlaswealth.com. If you're not a reader, get on there. A lot of good information. There's a blog post on there, and we've taken a lot of the information from an article that the Australian Financial Review did. And what they did was they compared the Labor Party versus the Liberal Party and how the property market performed during each tenure. And it's quite dramatic. So under the Libs, and Johnny Howell was the best time if you go back at the last 20 years, under the Libs, the average rate of return for property was 8.1% per annum, whereas under Labor, it's 2.3. Now, whether that's because of bad coincidence or tax changes or what it might be. So have a look at that article because it's quite an interesting article, and we've sort of put our own commentary on top of that as well. But now expats are now going, okay, you think about if you're in the Lib situation, they've got no leader. It's whoever they select is not going to be ready in 3 years' time for the next election.
Mm.
So Libs are probably like, you know what, we've lost the next one as well. So let's plan for the one after. So technically speaking, there's a good possibility that Labor might be in for the next 2 terms.
Yeah, yeah.
So
And some of the things you mentioned before, yeah, you're spot on because they were talking about, Labor even was harping on about the franking credit refunds as
yep,
well. And trust is always a big one. There's actually a big court case going on back in Australia right now about trust distributions.
it's huge.
That's still ongoing. There won't be actually a decision on that one, but someone's essentially is taking on the ATO right now. And it is a huge case regarding distributions to beneficiaries and corporate beneficiaries. And that could actually change legislation. But now that you've got Labor coming in for a second term, they could introduce new legislation, probably to undo that. And then I forgot about franking credits, but franking credits was another one which they weren't too happy about, especially, I suppose, oldies, everyone that's invested in ASX blue chip shares going back
That lost in
back
the
to the
election in
90s.
2019, wasn't it?
Yep. So often they'll get a tax refund usually if they've got a good little healthy share portfolio in their individual names when they lodge their tax return because they've got no other income. They might get some age pension, but maybe not. But they didn't like that concept of getting a tax refund on tax you hadn't paid, especially when it's paid at the corporate level because of the franking credit, the imputation credit. You should just be entitled to the cash dividend and then that's it, rather than, I guess, on an accruals basis technically. So that's something which we could actually see come back up. Hopefully not, because I know a lot of people love those big refunds that they receive at the end of the
A lot of our
financial
clients.
year.
Yeah.
Yep. So, and that would also extend to, I would say probably superannuation as well. If they're not going to allow you to get the franking credit refund within an individual name, it doesn't make any sense for them to allow it to happen within self-managed super funds or wraps or whatever it might be. So that's another one that we'll be keeping a close eye on. And then probably the last one, which we haven't heard too much news about, modernising tax residency rules. Is that going to come back up now?
That's the big
Everyone
one.
thought, that's right. And I mean, everyone thought that $3 million, I suppose, conceptual tax with super had completely gone. I've been talking to clients since the start of the year because it had gone completely quiet in Australia. But only what seems the last 2 weeks since election have really hung the vote there in Parliament. It's come back up. So it's a case, well, maybe this could go through, and then how does it operate? But much like that one going quiet, modernising tax residency rules has been quiet in the background right now. Is this going to come back, and could this be something that gets legislated in the next 12 months, causing a big issue for a lot of Australians?
Yeah, I think we talked about this on the podcast, probably 3 to 6 months ago, about with the election coming up, the prospective timeframes if this does come up. Now, bearing in mind the incumbent government was re-elected, Labor can pick up where they left off with tax residency. They had Treasury doing a lot of work on it. We know that. So we did the consultation paper, but they went very quiet. Now that they've done, it's like par cooked, it's sort of, it's half done. Are they going to try and get it through? That's probably a positive for expats who reside in countries that don't have DTA protection, because some will say, oh, it's a bad rule. There's a lot of disjointed situations and scenarios that with this will clear things up, less grey, more black and white. The big question of the concern with the tax residency rules is it 45, 60 or 90? We have heard through the grapevine that there might be interest in 60. We're pushing for 90. Everyone's pushing for 90, but also to, some sort of measure or a scoring system on the factor tests. That has to be, if my wife Mel was living in Australia, how can that count for the same as me holding an Australian passport from a ties point of view? So we're hoping that there'll be a lot more cleaning up of that scoring system because, it's pretty ridiculous in terms of how they did it. Being a beneficiary of a trust. Now, trusts have been very popular in the last, sort of 20 years. I guarantee probably half the people who are listening to this right now are beneficiaries of their parents' family trust. They didn't know about it. So if you're a beneficiary of your parents' trust and you hold an Australian passport and you breach the day count, you're a tax resident. So, I think there's, a lot more. I think the next 12 months, you and I and the rest of the team, you're going to be bloody busy, to be honest with you. I think there's going to be so many things coming out. And this wish list that Labor's been sitting on for the last 10 years, they'll leak things and test the market and measure the temperature. But I think we're going to see over the next 3 years a rapid rate of change coming through, and not necessarily for the best.
Yeah, I think so. I think some of the things that they announced leading into the election, I think will be front of mind probably for the next 3 or 4 months. And that was things like the HEX debt 20%. So he's gone over the votes. We've got a lot of young voters there. There was, I suppose, providing a bit more incentive around the Medicare bulk billing. And then also childcare was a massive one for Albanese as well. He wanted to make sure everyone is entitled to at least 3 days of free childcare in Australia. So that was actually technically, I think it was still means tested based on income level. I think it wasn't assets tested. So that will be an interesting one if he heads off those 3 items, but then in the background you've got these other tax reform items happening in the background. So yeah, it's going to keep us busy, I would say, for the next 12 months, with the next couple of years, keeping a very close eye on that one.
And just for the folks on the call too who are looking to make HEX payments, we've done a calculation blog, which by the time this podcast goes out, it'll be on our website, atlaswealth.com. And we've gone through and looked at the scenario of, are you better off making a payment? Because everything indexes on the 1st of June. Are you better off making a payment now with the indexing and the discount coming off the reduced amount? Or are you better off waiting for the reduced, the decrease and then making a payment? So have a look at our website for those numbers as well too.
Yep, that's right. Really, that's a really good one actually. But yes, going to be interesting. I think those 3 things he'll focus on, but then in the background we'll start to see these other bit of a tax reform.
We'll be dusting off the old cobwebs and we took it.
The old playbook. We can do what we want now. Got the run of the house. So it's going to be interesting. We'll keep our finger on the pulse there to see what's going on, to see if they sneak through. Interesting times ahead.
Mate, it is. And I think we wrap it up there. People are probably sick of the election by now. There was so much build up to the lead up. Now we've just sort of distilled it. But, sorry, folks, we're going to be talking this for a while now because I think there's going to be a lot coming through the pipeline. Not necessarily next week or next month, but certainly over the next 12 months anyway.
Yep, absolutely, mate. Anyway, thanks for your time, guys. Thanks for tuning in on another episode. And Brett, as always, thanks for your time.
Thanks, James. Thanks, folks. And we'll see you on the next episode. See you later.